In 2011, after a misinterpretation of Watchmen and a strangely violent children's film about owls, Zack Snyder delivered his first wholly original entry to cinema with Sucker Punch. By this point, he'd already ceased to be 300's visionary new voice and become a divisive Michael Bay-like figure, perceived simultaneously as shallow and trying too hard to be deep. Sucker Punch demonstrates that paradox nicely. It's at varying times a superhero action adventure, a psychological thriller, a drama, a parable, and a musical. Its title is apropos for a few reasons, not least of which is that the entire effort is a big swing, even for a guy known for big swings. It broke even, a bomb by Hollywood standards. In critical circles, it likewise bombed, unfavorably compared to a video game and criticized for its characters' lack of depth. True Neutral primarily deals in archetypes, mythopoeia, and anthropology's intersection with film and pop culture, so I fear Snyder will be coming up quite a bit, mostly as examples of what not to do, as he tends to miss the mark just to the right at his best and at his worst. But I'm opening our relationship to Zack Snyder with a bit of apologetics, because not only was Sucker Punch not given a fair shot, it may be Snyder's magnum opus, a film whose supporting character's tropishness is part of its underlying narrative. It's the only one of his films whose theatrical cut is the definitive. Watch the original if you can. Its critics focus on the paradox of its female empowerment message and its adolescent male visuals, but this is its coup de grace. Sucker Punch is feminism, but it isn't for women, girls, or even men. It's for boys.
I'm not here. This isn't happening.
A term like world building, prior to The Lord of the Rings, likely conjured images of the gods themselves. While mythopoeia had been practiced since the very first myth, indications are only the witch doctor, the scribe, and eventually the poet, if even they, knew the why and how of it. It is the industrialized, modern world that deconstructed and then played with mythology and archetypes so that everyone could hear, without the intention they be believed. Richard Wagner's Ring Cycle, with its leitmotifs, chiasm, and complete rewrite of Norse myth, cast a long shadow over storytelling, from Tolkien to George Lucas to Snyder. The first literary mythopoet of the 20th century was probably Lord Dunsany, whose King of Elfland's Daughter set the stage for Tolkien and Lewis. It is Dunsany's 1908 book, Gods of Pegana, however, that shook H.P. Lovecraft to his core. Lovecraft's racism, xenophobia, and paranoia would have gone into overdrive reading Pegana, where Dunsany uses the language of indigenous myth to fabricate an entire pantheon of gods with unpronounceable names and inscrutable motives. Combined with Robert Chambers' King in Yellow stories, where a fictional document drives its characters mad, and you have the Lovecraft mythos. One of the scariest things about Pegana to a late 19th century mind could be how Dunsany weaves no human narrative beneath his gods, no believers, no heroes or villains operating an epic narrative within its world, just a cosmology, beautiful and inviting, and you, who must decide whether or not to believe in them without the distance of a fictional persona. To someone raised without alternatives to Christianity, such a beautifully convincing one could seem potentially maddening, even without its demonstration of how a religion could spring forth whole cloth from a single human mind. Some 40 years later, Joseph Campbell's description of the monomyth or hero's journey in the 1949 masterpiece of comparative religion, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, would become the popular diagram of how to execute a journey through such a Dunsanian mythos. A guide to making your own Odyssey to go with your new Olympian canon, if you will. Hero was popularized for its associations with Star Wars when George Lucas acknowledged its influence on his mythopoeia. Its deconstruction of myth and religion inspired countless writing how-tos. Star Wars thus marks the end of the era of conscious mythopoeia, i.e. modernism, and begins one of increasingly deconstructed, self-referential pop culture and an over-informed, overly critical, and media-savvy audience that sees the seams of narrative and have tired of its repetitions. In other words, postmodernism. But the point of Hero wasn't teaching people how to write. Joseph Campbell wasn't deconstructing narrative, he was deconstructing dreams. Hero with a Thousand Faces is less a comparative religion document than a work of Jungian and Freudian psychology, an investigation into the motifs that repeat not only in mythology, fairy tales, and fables, but in our minds, dreams, and memories, the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. Stories follow this structure because it is simply how things work, or how our brain organizes our memory of things at any rate. We learn we must change. We try to live without changing because we fear the death of our ego. We fail and ego death happens anyway. We reconstruct ourselves into the changed being we should have become the first time, are reborn, and solve the problem as the new person. This is the pattern of how interesting events and personality shifts transpire. One could view postmodernism as a movement, as the inability to move from ego death to rebirth, an inability to admit that we have already died and that it is time to reconstruct. Sigmund Freud, the modern discoverer of dream analysis, divided the consciousness into three layers: the id, ego, and superego. Roughly, the id is our base desires for food, companionship, sex, and shelter. The ego is the construction of the self and identity that represses those desires to make less impulsive choices. The superego decides between which of the other two to listen to based on sets of ideals. Freud defined fantasy as a disguise covering multiple, often repressed wishes that hide the mechanisms by which the dreamer maintains safe distance from their repressed wish while simultaneously experiencing it. The omission of the ego's point of view opens up a third-person perspective, allowing us to see through more than one character at the same time, to see oneself and to see oneself seeing oneself. Carl Jung's consciousness also had layers, but they were more ethereal and rooted in occult poetics, mythology, and alchemy. Jung's consciousness sits atop our unconscious motivations and thoughts, the stuff of dreams, and that sits atop the vast underworld of the collective unconscious that unites all living things to be a shared symbolic language, which sits above the field uniting all matter. Jung's alchemy is panning out in quantum mechanics that find that it is much more likely for consciousness to become matter than the other way around.
Is missing about how the quantum world becomes the classical world is something which I think is the only place where you would have non-computational activity. So if we think non-computationally, we must be making use of whatever that physics is that goes from the quantum to the classical world.
It pans out in hypnosis and ritual magic, where metaphorical language is used to help subjects communicate with their subconscious and alter their perceptions and reality. It also pans out in narrative, where allegorical and archetypal storytelling turns out to be how we suss out large moral problems in times of crisis, and that the influence goes both ways. How we think informs how they are portrayed, but how they are portrayed also informs our worldviews and thus how we think and behave. Archetypes are the superego's ideals, the geometric shapes and the mathematics of our dreaming minds, and the language of the dreamer beneath. Dream is the working of our unconscious mind, stories told with symbols that compress complex representations of ourselves, others, and forces outside of our control into archetypes. Myth is waking dream, telling allegories inhabited by those archetypes to process dangerous truths. Mythopoeia, then, is the conscious manipulation of myth-making and using them to inform how the superego makes decisions. Jung, Freud, Dunsany, Chambers, Tolkien, Campbell, Crowley, Marx, and Goebbels can all be seen as an invisible revolution of the early 20th century, the mastering of the technology of myth, and a demonstration of how it can affect the common person by influencing the stories they tell themselves about themselves. Sucker Punch takes place in various layers of Baby Doll's psyche, where the deeper we delve, the more archetypal and ideal the representations become. At top of our viewpoint is Baby Doll's backstory, where she accidentally kills her sister while trying to save her from their abusive stepfather. This plays out as a music video set to a cover of the Eurythmics' Sweet Dreams as performed by Baby Doll herself, actress Emily Browning, culminating in her institutionalization. What at first appears to be a flash forward to a lobotomy where she sees the items she will need to escape becomes a burlesque being rehearsed on a stage, happening to Sweet Pea, who demands it stop. The opening appears as a Wagnerian overture, a technique called prolepsis, wherein an opening scene presages the entirety of the larger story it introduces, as an overture delivers all of the leitmotifs that will occur throughout the larger opera. Snyder here uses a literal overture, which then directly addresses the pop culture literate, postmodern audience and winks at anyone prepared to notice it. Sucker Punch's hypersexual adolescent boy rendition of a traumatic, all too common and oppressively mundane evil in women's lives wears the production design of exploitation and yet never actually does it, and instead always chooses to show us male cruelty instead. As this occurs to the viewer, so it occurs to the movie itself, as Sweet Pea, the hero of the story, notes this on stage.
Is there a problem, Sweet Pea?
This is a joke, right?
This is the key moment in the film, akin to the first 30 seconds of Mulholland Drive. In this monologue, we find 4 layers of interpretation, all intentional. Of all the characters, Sweet Pea, although initially antagonistic, is the closest to an empowered, legitimately strong, and realistically, at least for this film, portrayed female character. Here she comments with disgust and dismay, but mostly the voice of the Warner Brothers executive when she says,
It's to turn people on. I get the sexy little schoolgirl. I even get the helpless mental patient, right? That can be hot. What is this? Lobotomized vegetable? How about something a little more commercial, for God's sakes?
Beneath that, it is the critic. Is Snyder trying to turn me on? If so, why is he portraying a girl-interrupted, Oscar-bait plot as if it's a superhero origin? For a film that, it could be argued, is constructed to purposefully avoid Academy consideration. Is this supposed to be sexy? Certainly it's how Warner Brothers sold it to us. How disturbing. Beneath that, the most important layer, the teenage boy who came to be turned on by sexy, scantily clad girls fighting samurai mechs, being hoodwinked into watching a movie about the abuse of young women by the kind of men whose ranks he is on track to join. Am I supposed to be turned on by this? Does someone think this is sexy? Should I try to be turned on by this? And all at once, as Sweet Pea asks the question out loud just as we think it, the answer becomes a resounding no. This movie is aware of itself, aware it requires interpretation, and aware it will be misinterpreted unless it comes out announcing its intentions. It says, yes, I see it too. No, I'm not doing what an ad campaign must surely have told you I was doing. Yes, this is going somewhere, just not where you thought. The asylum is horrific, so we escape to a third layer, where all of the same characters interact in a burlesque house secretly doubling as a brothel and criminal headquarters. Here, her stepfather is a priest who has sold her. She is an innocent victim. Within this burlesque, she dances to entertain and eventually distract the guards so that her escape plan can be enacted. During these dances, she dissociates to a fourth layer where she and her fellow dancers are superheroes fighting faceless evils and defeating them. But even the asylum layer is dubious. Not only are its archetypes intensely fairy tale and Cinderella-esque, but we are brought to this layer through a curtain on a stage, and that same stage we find improbably in the asylum, where her backstory seems to be playing out without Baby Doll's involvement. Baby Doll has already dissociated by the time we enter, perhaps in the opening, where she sleeps. Nothing in Sucker Punch is actual or factual, but all of it is real, at least in one sense. The emotional intensity you as a viewer experience conveys how the events feel to Baby Doll. It is a wholly subjective experience of her state and how she sees and experiences the world, and thus by definition how she remembers the events depicted. There are different kinds of fantasy. When spelled with an F, it is purely pretend without purpose, play, often using the character tropes and stories inherited from medieval folklore, but with one's self represented in the story. Even this has purpose. Play is good for the mind and soul. Role play, like the flexing of our empathic muscles, and escape from our own identity reaffirms our conscious decision to be who we are. It makes us saner, more confident, and empowered. Who are we really, i.e., who do we choose to become, moment to moment, rather than who we remain out of habit? The other kind, with a PH, is a form of fantasizing one needs in order to deal with psychological trauma, by making a safe place for our psyche to hide from an unbearable reality, a place to shut away our sanity from a maddening, continual hell. Like any medicine, it becomes a disease only when we refuse to stop taking it. Baby Doll's sequences do not offer avoidance of the unsavory portions of Baby Doll's life, only escape. We are introduced to what is really happening, but look away to her fantasy world rather than live through it. To show it would be to join in the fetishization, and indeed tell the young man in the audience it was acceptable to get off on Baby Doll's pain. Instead, we are left to agonizingly sit through the adolescent fantasy and suspense. What is really happening while we watch these superhero sequences? We are not allowed to see, because Baby Doll doesn't want to see it, and Baby Doll is the film, and the film does not want us to see it. Baby Doll wants you to see what's real. Stay with her, in her head, feel how it feels to save them, feel who these girls are to her, superheroes, and not be blinded by facts, the surface of your subjective view of reality, or by pity. To present them as components in an objective reality would be to make them objects for your judgment and be dishonest. The fantasy may not be true, but it is honest. All of this is Baby Doll's processing of her sister's death. In a dream, all characters are aspects of the dreamer. In this way, the supporting cast are each an aspect of the real three-dimensional girl somewhere, strapped to a chair waiting for the hammer to fall, or somewhere even higher up in a different layer. Each little dissociative world she constructs tells us the kinds of things she's been drawn into, and thus incorporated into her dreams. To see this girl as two-dimensional is, in a way, to refuse to do the work of interpreting these dream layers to solve the puzzle of her character. We are inside her, drowning in her, claiming she has no depth because we cannot see the bottom. A matryoshka stacking doll of Freudian fantasy, Jungian archetypes, and Campbellian monomyths wrapped around the trauma of our true central character. Heroism and idealism often inspire eye-rolling and irritation in a viewer when they are embodied by the lead. They are more easily swallowed as a thing encountered, hindered, or enabled by our viewpoint character rather than something we ourselves possess. If you encounter greatness, will you help it or jealously fight it? Baby Doll does her part from sequence to sequence, and because of her control over what ends up on the celluloid, seems like the hero. In fact, she is the invitation. Only one character is in their normal world at the beginning of the story. Only one character rejects the call and is forced to accept it, only to enter another world and change her situation. One character has done nothing to deserve to be in the institution. Only one has purely selfless motives, one whose loss of a sister is not caused by her actions but in spite of their efforts to save them. Only one character has agency from start to finish, moving the plot with her choices and actions, free in reality and trapped in her mind to save her sister, the foil of Baby Doll's purely mental freedom. One who questions the layers of boyish fantasy and escapism in the plot. One who is not dressed in a sexualization of male uniform, but as Jeanne d'Arc, an actual strong woman burned at the stake for having visions. And only one character who truly escapes in the end due to the sacrifice of those who came before her, a stand-in for the modern young woman who walks free because of her mothers and grandmothers, the women who did sex work, played men's games, and died so that she could live free. And all of it is a play on a stage, where the part of Baby Doll is played by Sweet Pea, implying that Baby Doll is a character Sweet Pea puts on. Then here, she seems to appear in the establishing shot of the members of the asylum. Twice. Is that Abby Cornish? I can't be sure. I've looked through the IMDb, the background dancers listed don't match as well as Cornish. It sure looks like Abby Cornish playing an actual mental patient in one corner of the room, while a completely sane and made-up Abby sits on the stage playing out Baby Doll's backstory. If this is the real Sweet Pea, then Baby Doll is for sure just another aspect, and the primary ego is seated in this chair, playing chess with herself, processing the death of her sister. If so, it's my favorite shot in the film.
I'm the star of the show, remember?
Whether Sucker Punch is great or enjoyable, I cannot answer for you. Like any over-stylized director, Snyder's melodramatic, glossy, hyper-cinematographic style and trailer-first plotting can either be the height of beauty for its own sake or cloyingly edgelord. Arguably every director of this type is both. I'm only here to tell you it's doing more than you assume, and that rather than seeing Snyder as another Michael Bay, unconcerned with substance, or J.J. Abrams incapable of not doing references, try watching with the same forgiving eye as you do a Baz Luhrmann, Tim Burton, or at least a Tarsem Singh. Bay, Singh, and Snyder all graduated from the same Pasadena design school. Bay has leaned into the truck commercial part of his nature and lost his more visionary components. Snyder and Singh are still doing high-concept music videos. The Snyder of 2004 was still trying to say big things bigly. Sucker Punch, The Cell, Mulholland Drive, Identity, and Inception are the same concept executed in different ways. The transformation of a character psychology into a virtual environment that threatens to conquer them. Each work a response to and participation in the layered plots introduced by several virtual reality films a few years prior. Of all of them, Sucker Punch has been judged the most harshly, and based mostly on its surface visuals. Admittedly, Snyder's unrestrained visual style all but begs you to experience nothing else. But most interpreted the film before they walked in based on how they felt about the director or trailer, judged its deviations from the norm as incidental, and where it fit their expectations as the intention. But the film begs the opposite. In other words, I don't think you know if you like it yet. We cannot preach to the choir to get progress. We can make feminist movies about lesbians for a feminist lesbian audience all day, and it will do some good for a time. Inclusion is valuable, but overvalued and overrepresented in Western media. It aligns nicely with demographic marketing in our content models, so it's the most profitable version of appeasing the underrepresented. Identity representation as a thin mask over demographic marketing may sound cynical, but so is capitalism. If we proselytize only to those who agree with us, minute differences amplify. People we have almost everything in common with leave to start their own, even tighter niches, and the old guard slowly pass into the West, until finally we find ourselves singing alone in a virtual fantasy of a righteous world, rather than using our hymns to transform the nonfiction outside. In order to progress, we need cooperation. In order to cooperate, we need to recruit. Recruitment is not about changing others to fit our idea of what the group already is, but restating the message in the language of both our opposition and potential opposition. If you're not trying to convince someone, then why are you talking, other than to hear yourself speak? So we return to our initial confusion. Why deliver what is ultimately a female empowerment allegory in the trapping of adolescent boys' sexual fantasies? By crafting the entire film of male lures and a hypnotizing fantasia to confuse and distract the misogynist shallow affect, but placing within it the seeds of a feminist message, incepting the young boy with empathy for the female plight he sought to escape, it makes the theater of the audience the largest doll in the Matryoshka stack. Isn't then the film doing exactly what it's telling you it set out to do? It feints right to take you down with a sucker punch left.